you seem to have this very powerful sense of directionality in your life. And I also want to know about your boyhood when you were younger, and I want to go back to chess a little bit because it seems to have been, well, when I was reading the book, I was thinking about, in one sense, it's the form of ultimate escapism, and the other sense, it's a form of actually going deeper into life, and that kind of comes back to what we're talking about retreat versus let's say action, or being away from the world versus going out into the world and doing something, activism versus meditation. Is my question clear here? Yeah.
It's a lot of questions, but
yeah, I mean, it's a lot of questions at once. But
I'll try. So, well, as I say in the book, chess was initially just a family pursuit, like any other, like a game, like football, like Monopoly, just something we did. But then somewhere along the way, I got good enough at it to begin to feel it was a bit more meaningful than that. That it was a kind of cultural practice of some kind, that I was taking part in a tradition of some kind. Mm-hmm. That there were these
an art also, or a sport as well, but something between.
Yeah, but it was a structured form of life. Mm-hmm. In a way that maybe Tiddlywinks wasn't, or there was a sort of sense of being part of an institution or a tradition. And then I got to meet some grown-ups who were part of that world, and I quite liked them, and I was very curious about the world they were in. And then various things happened in my family. My father's mental illness became worse. My parents split up. My brother became unwell. I buried my head in books for school to some extent, but the main coping mechanism was chess. And it was a field of life where I was in control, where I was independent mostly. I mean, actually thoroughly dependent on others in some ways. Families who would drive me to tournaments, and people who would feed me, and people who would pay the tournament entry fee, but still psychologically fairly independent.
It was some kind of suffering and even reckoning with death, which goes along what we're talking about, which kind of gave you that direction.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of sublimation going on. Sorry about that. So yeah, a certain amount of escapism, but in the book I write about this, there's a whole chapter on escapism in some ways. And I call it the sort of lesson of the chapter. Each chapter has a kind of takeaway idea. And in this one, it's we have to make peace with our struggle. I think that's, for me, what chess was about. It wasn't wishing away, wanting to be a different family or wanting to be another person, but it was a way of sort of reenacting and re-experiencing the struggle I was going through, and to some extent overcoming it, because I kept on facing this resistance and these battles, getting better and better and better, and feeling myself growing in autonomy and mastery. It was a kind of relief, and also a way of feeling safe, in a sense, rather than trying to retreat from the world. That was sort of deeper into the fight, and winning it sort of mattered.
So almost like you need to do battle in an imaginative realm before you can do battle in the real world.
Something like that. Although remember, we're talking about a young boy here who I now have children of a similar age when I started playing chess, and they don't have that much power. They might think they do, but it wasn't. It was something about experiencing through the game what I couldn't experience or feel properly. Like it was as if I couldn't access the feelings I had to feel anywhere other than chess. And in that sense, it was very important.
And also, there's other thing I was thinking about as I was reading your book was, it's also in one level, it's a game, it's fun, it's completely, it doesn't have a meaning to it except in a game. So there's this paradox between it being deadly serious and being just absurd play.
Right, absolutely. So
I love that, and all the characters that you met who played chess, and and these maverick figures, and it's like an alternative universe, or but it's also very real and more real than real on some level.
Absolutely. And so it speaks to life in general in that sense. And the what you just mentioned there, there's a version of that in the book. The writer George Steiner, whom I believe, New York, wrote for the New Yorker at least, and many other places. But he described chess as ultimately insignificant but enormously meaningful.
Yeah, there you
ultimately
go.
Insignificant but enormously meaningful. And that is true to my experience.
Yeah.
And I suppose I wrote the book because both things seem equally true. And in some ways, it was a way of processing what that had been about. And by the end of it, how it ends with the poem and everything. I sort of feel a little bit more of the. I feel them both ultimately insignificant and enormously meaningful.
Yeah.
But I managed to feel at peace with it being ultimately insignificant.
That's great. Yeah.
Without losing the meaning.
Well, so maybe the work of articulating that in your book, because a lot of people have a sport or have a something they do that they excel at, but they don't have the gift of articulating that at the same time. So that's kind of interesting that you can articulate that in such a way.
It took a long time, and writing a book is a big commitment. But I think there's a lovely line by Ted Hughes, the poet. He says that we write to take fuller possession of our experience.
That's it. That's it.
And that's how it feels. I feel as though, in developmental terms, previously sort of chess had me for many years, but now through the process of writing the book, there's a sense in which I have chess. It's still there, but I'm no longer lost in it somehow.
You're no longer lost in it, and it's been a platform for you to move into all these other things that matter to you.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. In terms of the other question you asked about direction, I'm quite pleasantly bemused by that, in the sense that
okay.
I don't obviously recognize myself in that. However, I suppose it can look like that retrospectively. Like, our lives teach us who we are, and there were certainly some lean years where I spent 2 or 3 years doing nothing in particular, with chess. Chess was a kind of cover story for that.
Ah, that's great. I love that, because it looks like you have all this like direction, but much of the learning is just fooling around. It's just just in between things, traveling around and just fooling around, and
quite a lot of existential angst along the way of what am I doing? Failed applications, careers attempted, languages begun and dropped. Various unfinished businesses. But when you look back, I don't really regret any of it. I'm quite glad for all those different false roads and false starts. You sort of need them somehow to.
Yeah, and that's everybody's life. Nobody has a sort of it all figured out and a plan, and then they follow this plan. Okay, very good. Well, let's start with Peterson. Let's get that over with.
Yeah.
Because I wrote this article a long time ago, just kind of a critique of your article about Peterson. I also said in the article I thought it was probably the best critique of Peterson that I'd read. But I was also critiquing your critique. And then when I saw you in Kiev, I kind of wanted to apologize for it, but I didn't. And I still don't know whether I should apologize for it or not.
I don't think so. No, I think you slightly misread me, maybe, but
probably I'm sure I did. It was just a blog post.
Yeah, exactly. We take these things way too seriously. I mean, what I can say is that it was a very intense experience. Becoming aware of him, briefly meeting him, being on the stage with him, dealing with the fallout of that, and then the day after, feeling, I hesitate to say possessed, but something like the energy was still there. Kind of the intensity of that encounter was still with me. It was psychoactive somehow.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say one more thing before you tell us. You wrote a very big, long essay about him. And I wrote about him. I was thinking probably the amount of words we wrote about him is equivalent, except I wrote like a lot of blog posts about him. And I didn't have the discipline perhaps to put that into one essay. It was just how I felt at the time. And so I think we were both possessed by speaking about and thinking about Peterson. And you called that Petersonianitis?
Petersonitis, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, go on.
Right. Well, it was an interesting period. So in some ways, we're speaking now about early 2018 for me. Yeah. So 2 years ago, fully. And I just briefly mentioned, of course, that I believe Jordan Peterson, I'm not sure quite what I should call him, but he, he's struggling at the moment. And for what it's worth, I wish him well. And, I met his wife on the day, and, they're human beings, and whatever else happens, they're going through very difficult times. And I don't wish that on anyone. It was very intense because Peterson was sort of on the front line of the culture war.
Yeah.
And I was on the stage thinking that I was being something like an honest broker, trying to bring out what I knew was his real quality in certain spheres. There was a certain quality of psychological and theological depth, and an intensity of communication, and a passion that I felt was missing in public life. And I thought, there's a lot going on here. There's a reason people are drawn to this person. He has a certain prophetic quality that we're missing, right?
Yeah.
And especially my sort of liberal progressive chums, who were just finding him, were just allergic. They just couldn't see it at all. They just saw him as the bogeyman.
As the devil or something, yeah.
Right, and I thought that wasn't the whole story. On the other hand, having tried to sort of elicit from him slightly more nuanced positions on, for example, climate change, the way his fans viewed that online was that I was just typecast as any other lefty, and there was even one particular YouTube video that I think said leftist host
was destroyed by Peterson or something,
or something like that, or attacks Peterson, instantly regrets it, or and these things were viewed in their millions, like literally millions of times. And I was right at the center of that, and partly because of that, walking around the streets, my hairdresser, my neighbor, my people at my son's school, they said, are you that guy who was speaking with Peterson? That's how big it was at the time. So it was a very intense experience. And I actually took about 2 or 3 months, I forget exactly how long, to write that piece on Medium. That's now on Medium.
Yeah.
The other thing that went wrong is that I thought, because I'd spent so long in it, I should try and publish it somewhere big and, get more attention for it. Because I felt what was going on was really important, which was not so much what Peterson's saying, because anyone can read the books or watch the videos and make their judgment.
Yeah.
Not so much really the cultural, we have a word in Scots, stramash, like mess, fangle, confusion, that was a fallout from that, about Peterson, yes or no, right? That also felt a bit lame, really a culture that obliges us to pick a side, like, surely we can learn better than that and find the active ingredients, the insights, without buying into someone wholesale. And yet, polarization is such that was difficult. And so what I was writing about is, what do you do in that context? Yeah. Having absorbed a lot of his material, having gone through a little bit of the culture war, and not really being on any particular side of that. So amongst the sort of meta game community, as we sometimes call ourselves, trying to think, well, what can I say about Peterson that's of any value? Yeah. And I tried, as you know. You were right, I think, in some ways, that I was there was a little part of me that was trying to be smarter than Peterson. There's a little part of me that was trying to beat him at his own game and out-nuance the professor. And maybe there was a little bit of hubris in that. Yeah. But it was still,
you were probably right in your critique of me as being trying to monopolize the situation to get people to pay attention to my articles. I mean, I just have to write something about Peterson even today, and I'll get thousands of people that will read it. So it's temptation,
Well, there's that, but I mean, also, it was connected to lots of other things. But suffice to say that I think that essay might still be one of the best things I've written, because it was so important for me to process what I'd gone through, to be right at the heart of that culture war. It wasn't really about him at all. Not really. It was about what he signified about where we are, and our inability to speak coherently in this somewhat contaminated cultural context. And yet to bring to bear the things that were forgotten, like, what is your answer to the climate collapse?
Yeah.
Where are you on inequality? What is happening to democracy? Where are those questions in this debate? And can you listen to what he's saying without just watching those little fragmented clips that show you in your filter bubble what you want to see?
Oh, sure. Well, the funny thing for me is that I was characterized as a sort of Peterson fanboy that was just supporting him, but I actually had some criticisms in my articles of him. And you were characterized as, you know, attacking Peterson and a progressive, you know, social justice warrior, but you actually had some appreciation for certain aspects of his thinking. So it's funny, like we got pushed on this other side, whereas only now I guess we're having a
well, this is the thing about
an open conversation about it,
right? And I mean, you know, it's not about him, it's not about us, it's about, you know, the predicament, which is, how do you speak of contentious matters in a way that goes beyond picking a side? You know, how do you get beyond tribal affiliation as your primary reference point for a public conversation? And that's what Peterson brought into the public square. It was like, okay, here is this very intense, somewhat toxic, for many very inspiring cultural warrior who also did other things. You know, he signified expertise, but he didn't always speak about his area of expertise. He played off that, and yet he would often be very speculative on political matters, and people would only hear that, but not hear where he really was quite profound. I mean, all of that was going on. So it was a kind of epistemic, what was it? Thunderstorm, really. It was a sort of epistemic thunderstorm in which no one really knew how to orient themselves adequately. Yeah. Some just became fanboys or fangirls, mostly fanboys, of course. Some just thought, this is just a misogynist who's into himself, he's a performer. And those two worlds weren't part of the same world. They were watching their own versions of reality, and then they were attacking each other, and the attack was part of how the reality perpetuated itself. And so I could feel both sides of that because of the networks that I'm in. And, you know, I was conflicted because I didn't think he was A, the good guy, B the bad guy, or C, somewhere in between. I thought something else was going on. So
what was going on? Can we look at that now? Like, what for me, I think he blew open a huge, you know, possibility. Whereas there are some problematic aspects of his thinking, but at the same time, I see him as blowing up this huge possibility and now disappearing. Like he's not there anymore. He's gone. He was so present on some level, at least if you were a person who spent any time online, and now he's just gone.
Right.
The whole conversation about him is almost over or something, and it's like he's just dead. Or I mean, I don't want to. I mean,
sure.
it's very odd. It's very
well. You might say it's odd, although for many this was always on the cards. He looked like a shooting star somehow.
Oh, sure.
It's an extraordinary trajectory that couldn't continue itself. But I mean, my answer to what was going on is I forget how long it was. It was roughly about 10,000 words, 2 or 3 months of work, trying to process that. I think it's called Cultural Indigestion, What We Learned and Failed to Learn from Jordan Peterson's Rise to Fame. As you know there, I go through 12 different perspectives on him, some of which were about his thoughts, some of which were about the reaction to him, some of which were about critique, some of which were about kind of appraisal. You know, it's no accident that people like, for example, Ken Wilber have highlighted that he was onto something important. But equally, he was partial. You know, he was true but partial. He was tapping into the lost spiritual dimension of our lives. He was critiquing liberalism indirectly by saying, look, he was also critiquing certain aspects of postmodernism, although perhaps caricaturing them too. A lot was going on. He was prismatic, I think. That was one of the words I used to make sense of him. He was also fairly I call them multiphrenic, because unlike schizophrenia, which is a kind of disorder, he could move between the kind of avuncular, sympathetic guy who guides you through life to the somewhat shrill cultural warrior who attacks someone in the tenor that will get the maximum amount of retweets. So he was just, like I say, a kind of epistemic thunderstorm that we needed to get out of the rain for a while to make sense of it. It's not as though, I don't think he himself or his thought is particularly important, actually. I think when you look very closely at Maps of Meaning and the 12 Rules for Life and his videos, there's a lot of fascinating material there. But the biggest part of the fascination was the spectacle.
Yeah.
It was just this man on fire with a determination to make sense.
Well, one thing that I noticed is that most people weren't really paying attention to his actual ideas. They were mostly paying attention to the spectacle. That's true.
I mean, I think...
And I don't think his ideas, I think he was doing a good job of bringing Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and all of these thinkers who I loved in my 20s, you know. Yeah. I mean, if he had been around in my 20s, I just would have, you know, I always think that my interest in him was like not me right now, where I'm at right now, but my 20-year-old self who was reading Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn and just really deeply into the existentialism and Carl Jung and all that. And so that's where I come from in terms of. Right. So when there's this guy speaking about him with such charisma and eloquence, I ate it up completely. While at the same time, you know, I had, you know, I don't think his critique of postmodernism is very deep, and no, and I think that he is a he does tend to have caricaturized, you know, positions on things, and he attacks social justice warriors when he's being a social justice warrior. You know, I could see all that critique. At the same time, I don't think he was insincere. I think he had his weaknesses, and he was being attacked in such a pathetic, you know, malevolent way by a lot of people at the same time that I felt I had to, you know, defend him against that on some level.
Right. I mean, for what it's worth, in the essay, the first symptom of Petersonitis I describe as mesmerized intellectual excitement at the spectacle of passionate thinking, laced with confusion at what exactly is being said. Mm-hmm. And that's and then I have moral dumbfounding arising from the intuition that Peterson is wrong in important ways, even when his reasoning is persuasive. And then finally, and slightly, you know, playfully, emotional exhaustion caused by too many hours expecting answers from an anguished face on a computer screen. Because of course his rise to fame was principally online, and you know, these videos that were watched by and shared so widely. But suffice to say that I think as a cultural phenomenon, he was very important, because he spoke to people in a way others were not speaking to. You know, the comparison I used in the intro actually was Noam Chomsky. Mm-hmm. And when I said that to some people on the sort of...
Well, he's like Noam Chomsky on some level, you were saying.
Well, in the sense that he inspired sort of thousands of a particular kind of outlook and generation. He was meeting a need in the culture at the time to make sense of something. Chomsky was more about the military-industrial complex and, you know, abuse.
It was more about, you know, just getting your shit together on some level.
Yeah, he was about, you know, Chomsky's kind of abuses of power, look more deeply at the system, see how corrupt it is, see how hold power to account in the right way. And that was needed at the time. Peterson's more like, what's happened to the meaning of life? You know, and people are like, yeah, that's the question. Where is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad, to be honest, after writing that piece, I felt it was like an exorcism of sorts. You know, it was like, I haven't thought about him for the last 2 years, hardly at all. But I'm glad I went through it. You know, it was an experience. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was very personal for you. Like, I think that my critique of your article was that it was, you were saying that you were not being personal, where it seemed to me a very personal article on some level.
Right. Probably. I mean,
it seemed to be something very personal in it to you. Uh-huh.
It was personal because I was there with him, and personal because of where I am in my career as well. Like what Perspectiva is up to is partly about trying to bring to bear fundamental questions of meaning and purpose into the public realm in a way that informs debates about things like the economy and society and democracy. And Peterson seemed to be doing that. So on the one hand, he was like an ally. On the other hand, he was doing it in a way that was quite reactionary and quite, get back to basics, stop trying to think you can change the world, just tidy your room. And so I was conflicted between, on the one hand, he was a huge ally, bringing to bear the right kinds of questions. But I was also very ambivalent because he was doing it in such a way that he was antagonizing the kinds of people I felt needed to hear it most.
Interesting.
So that, it was personal in that professional sense. It might have been more than that. It was also that I felt I could see where he was correct and where he wasn't, and I wanted to make sense of that. But to be honest, you're right. I think there was a little bit, with hindsight, of motivated reasoning in terms of trying to sort of be the ultimate insight into Peterson. There's a certain hubris about that. And finally,
well, I kind of think what Nietzsche says, that everybody's philosophy is very personal on some level. So,
as you say, philosophies are very personal. And I think the thing about Peterson that wasn't said enough is that he has a very bleak, fairly dark outlook on life. And it's informed by the readings of Solzhenitsyn and reflecting on the Soviet Union and the Gulag. And for him, those were like, that's where reality is. That's the battle that must be fought and won at all times. That's
life is suffering, the first noble truth, but not the other ones.
Right, but this is not the Buddha's first noble truth. This was something more like the monster at the gate at all times that's waiting to come and eat you. It's less about.
So it's too much of a monomyth or something. That's
well, I feel. I suppose when I read some on the back of the Peterson experience, I read a bit more Solzhenitsyn, and I got to know Life in the Gulag. And I think for Peterson, Life in the Gulag is a very important reference point. Yeah. It's like things could be so much worse, and he's right, and we don't realize that enough. And with the virus at the moment, to come back to that, we're sensing that, right?
Well, I think was the important part of his message, in a sense. Is like kind of look at the potential for where what you could be, or you could be the camp guard at Auschwitz. And
there's the shadow issue, but it's also he maybe wasn't sufficiently clear at, yes, life is actually pretty peachy compared to how it could be in the Gulag. But there was a sense in which he always felt the Gulag was somehow the human default, that somehow that was our natural inclination to veer that way. If we didn't win the ideological battle in the right way, we would regress to that. And I'm not sure he ever quite won that argument. That was always more his personal stuff than something he actually convinced people of.
Okay. Okay.
Anyway, that's enough. I'm happy to.
Yeah, sure. That's great. I'm glad we had that conversation. I think I've also exercised Peterson out of my system through writing about him a lot, and I don't have much more to say about it. I move on, and I'm exploring other areas. Right.
I'm glad. I'm very glad.
I started to write about John Vervaeke. I started to study that.
Right.
And I didn't really want to be typecasted as being.
Sure.
Somebody who, because I, studied Buddhism for years. I have all these other interests. So again, it was a period. It was a very intense period, I think. It was.
And I don't think we need to feel any great regret about being part of it. And it passed a lot of people by. Some people have never heard of him. Some have heard of him who just don't like.
Yeah, some think, who's this guy?
Yeah, my impression also is those who are real scholars in the kind of domain, people like Zach, just wasn't that impressed. He
wasn't that impressed, yeah.
Sort of let it go. And so there are people who didn't get caught up in it. For me, it was a very good growth experience to go through it and process it.
Good. Okay, why don't you talk about what you're trying to achieve with Perspectiva, and what are your future projects and goals, and what are you looking towards?
Well, honestly, I'm winging it on a daily basis. Well, that's the truth.
It's an odd question right now because everything kind of stopped about.
Yeah, but I mean, leaving the virus to one side. Well, there's a little bit of a genesis story to make sense of this, which is that, as I mentioned, I did a spirituality project at the Royal Society of Arts in London, and that began around 2000 and let me get this right, 12, and went on until about 2014, 15. And around the same time, I was also working on climate change. And before that climate change project, I was working on behaviour change. So these were the three main sort of formative influences of my professional life. There was a lot of chess. There was a philosophy, politics, and economics degree. There was a mind, brain, and education degree that got me into psychology a bit more. And then there was a PhD on the idea of wisdom. So that was kind of in the background, a kind of theoretical psychology, philosophy, with a little bit of politics and economics thrown in. That was my kind of formation. And then there was chess. And then I got to this job at the RSA where basically if you raised your own funds, you could not quite do what you wanted, but it was a fairly porous environment. I mentioned that because my work on climate change was a kind of, I hesitate, it's going to sound a bit self-congratulatory, but I would say an introduction to political consciousness, in the sense that I began climate change thinking that how do I get people at home to change their light bulbs or to change their diet or fly less or whatever. And quite quickly when I looked into that, I thought, hang on, this is not going to cut it. There are these macroeconomic influences affecting our lives. There are these forms of advertising. There are these political structures which have vested interests as part of them. Then there's this global problem, and whatever we do here is dwarfed by what happens in China or India. And then there are these supply chains that are not part of the metrics. And meanwhile, the scientists are not really being listened to, and people are afraid of their deaths. And the whole thing began to look like multiple things. So climate change was a kind of waking up to the interconnected nature, not just of different features of a problem, but different ways of knowing. So climate change was at once a kind of climate change denial being connected to death denial, for example, consumerism being a kind of self-formation issue, identity issue. So all of that was going on, and then there was like, okay, but what are the economics of this? Where am I on carbon taxes? Where am I? So all of these questions are over. They happened at once, and that led to a project called the 7 Dimensions of Climate Change, which I wasn't really familiar with at the time with integral language and meta-modern language and stuff. But I suppose with hindsight, the 7 Dimensions of Climate Change combined with the Spirituality Project would have been like a kind of entry card into that community. It's like an attempt to think, on the one hand, quite deeply and existentially, but also across contexts.
Well, you mentioned Ken Wilber, and I think Ken Wilber had a big effect on me as well. And I wonder, this I guess an integral model.
Right. So I guess what happened is he wasn't a big formative influence. I was aware of him.
Right.
Only laterally, actually.
On me, he was, right.
As I was trying to make sense of what I was doing, people said, "Oh, it sounds a bit like this Wilber guy." That sort of, I caught up with that later on. But what happened was the Spirituality Project and the climate change work. Around that time, I met Thomas Bjorkman, who's a Swedish entrepreneur and also a philosopher. Yeah. He had read a lot of my material and said there aren't many people in public policy work trying to connect human development and spiritual questions. But in my experience at the Club of Rome, this is precisely what people need to hear to help them with their economic thinking and their societal design, right?
Right.
And he said, do you want to try, we can talk about how we do this. And I said, well, look, I'm at a bit of an impasse in my career. I've had 6 years here. I'd like to do something else. And so he gave me the seed funding to create this organization called Perspectiva. He was a co-founder. He remains, a trustee, and he set it up, and he gave the early funds to make it possible for me to quit my job. And I was expecting my second son at the time, so it was a very busy period. But then it was like, okay, well, what is this about then? What is the organizational mission and purpose? And we came quite quickly on the connection between three main things, which for those who've studied Wilber will again look very familiar. And we decided, partly based on Karl Popper, partly based on Guattari, and laterally we realized Wilber and a few others. But our tagline is systems, souls, and society. So it's about the connection between complex systems of various kinds, both natural and social and ecological, and the inner life of human beings and all its complexity, the totality of that inner life. Both the question of how we grow and change and develop, how we cultivate virtue maybe, but also spiritual experience and meaning and purpose and what it's all about. And then finally, society, and that's sort of where that Peterson essay I mentioned comes in a little bit. How do we talk about this stuff? How do we connect these worlds of the kind of, again, to bring in another model, in Wilber's terms, it was connecting the sort of left-hand side of the quadrants about the inner life and the shared inner life, the culture and the psychology, with the systems of, travel,
the machine,
health, the machine, if you like, health and education and economy and so forth, and also with the biology. What kind of an organism are we?
Yeah.
So that was the sort of origin story, and then I spent a few years trying to make sense of what it's about. We raised some funds from other places. We have a particularly valued partnership with the Fetzer Institute, who have as their mission to create a spiritual foundation for a loving world. And because I'd written Spiritualize, it was like, well, I've thought about spiritual foundations a bit, but not yet. It's a lifetime's work. It's not a finished project. And then we started a few things about activism. How do we become wiser activists? We have something about a project called the Digital Ego, which is about how do we make sense of what the ego's doing when it's online? And how do we improve that? And we also have a very important project called the Transformative Education Alliance, which is Zach's work and Bonita's
Perhaps
work.
if we talk again, we could talk more about education, because I think I'd love to talk to you more about that.
And then just briefly to finish that off, that's the sort of main body of work. We also have a little publishing arm, Perspectiva Press, which is creating, we're trying to specialize in short books especially, and particularly books that help sort of activist scholars get their work done, because books are cultural artifacts and kind of symbols of authority as much as bodies of content, right? So we have a role to play there in helping people do their work. And finally, as you know, because you were there in Kiev, there's Emerge, which is kind of our social network. Emerge is, it's not the same as Perspectiva. It has its own autonomy, but we have quite a big role in directing how what it's for and how it will evolve over time.
Right.
So that's, what I'm trying to do, honestly, get through the day, make sense of it the best I can, stay solvent, employ some people, build some interesting projects. Not quite hope for the best, but at the moment, I am working towards a clearer sense of plan and mission. But we're also in a world where planning looks a bit silly. So there's a sense in which I'm just sensing my way. And I do think that transformative education and making sense of what that means is very important. If there's one quotation that haunts me at the moment, it's by Thomas Metzinger, the German philosopher. He wrote a great essay called Spirituality and Intellectual Honesty. And he has a line in there which says words to the effect that over the next few years, as the effects of anthropogenic climate change hit home, we will increasingly experience ourselves as failing beings, because this first truly man-made planetary problem appears to exceed, and this is the key line, appears to exceed the present cognitive and emotional capacity of our species. And that, for me, is the heart of the matter. It's like, what are those capacities? What are the species' cognitive and emotional capacities? How do we work with them, cultivate them? It's not over till it's over. So if the problem is that those capacities are not up to speed and we need to change them, what does that mean? How do we do that? Which is where the educational imperative comes from.
Well, we have education without religio. as John Vervaeke puts it. And we don't mean religion, but just this, I guess, spiritual education that we deeply need, that is totally lacking from schools.
Yeah. And also it's about what society is for. So I mentioned economic growth. It's like, if we're not trying to just get slightly richer every year, what are we up to, right? And that's again where education comes in and says, well, have you thought about the human being and what it might be, what he or she might be for, or they might be for? That's a big project, but it's like flipping on its head the purpose of society, rather than having
and not economic growth, but real growth, spiritual growth towards awakening.
Right, exactly. And I'm glad to see the excitement there. That's exactly the palpable feeling I want people to have. Like it's what do we do when we stop trying to grow the economy and start trying to grow human beings in their societal context? And it's another conversation, but this is the heart of what they call in Germany and in the Nordic countries, Bildung, which roughly translates as transformative civic education. And it's not just about self-development, it's about self-development in response to societal need in your historical context. So that's a whole conversation, but that's roughly what we're about.
Great, wonderful. Oh, it's really cool that I'm talking to you. I also talked to Zach, and I talked to Bonita, and I've talked to all the people at Perspectiva, not intentionally, but you just have such an amazing group of minds there. So that's awesome. That's
thank you very much. And we're in a sense, the virus, as I say, highlights that we're in quite a difficult time. And there's a fair amount of despair around, and the challenge is just to find an alternative to despair, right? Find something meaningful to do that makes some kind of sense of what it might mean to mobilize as a response that would save civilization from itself over the next 100 years. In fact, I call Perspectiva an urgent 100-year project for that reason. There's an urgency to it, but there's also a need to get deep and real about what those changes will be politically and spiritually. And that's really, it's beyond me. And I feel out of my depth most days, but it does feel like the necessary work.
Yeah. I guess feeling out of your depth is at least if we're stumbling towards something, then we feel our lives are meaningful or
yeah, we have to have a kind of plausible story to tell about what we're up to, right? I think I called that in the book about chess. Chess used to be my alibi. I used to, when people would ask me the existential auditing question, what do you do with your time?
What do you do? What do you do?
You say, well, this is my story. This is my alibi for my existence to justify my presence on Earth.
And maybe no one label will suffice. Like I used to say, I'm a musician. I don't know what I am.
I still don't know what I say. I get tongue tied every time people ask me. But what I like though is there are certain cultures where they wouldn't dream of asking you that. Like it would feel like far too direct a question because it's a kind of status pegging, narrowing down, box putting question.
Right, and it's not a true question either because we're not one thing. We're legion, as Gurdjieff says.
Much better when I was at a party in Spain. I'll never forget someone coming up to me and saying, "Hello, what was the best moment of your day so far?" And I felt I'll be with this person all evening if they want me to be. Like it was just a very different kind of register from what do you do?
Right.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. There's warmth in that question and not just utilitarian or purpose or.
So humans as ends, not means. And that's a big part of the story. Yeah.
Well, it's been a huge pleasure talking to you, Jonathan.
Likewise. Thanks for
it's exceeded all my expectations and I'm very, very happy to connect and I'm going to edit this and, I don't know, maybe I'll put it out in 2 parts if it's too long for people to digest it at one sitting.
Whatever you like. And I think because of the virus, sooner is good, but I also know it's good to get it right. So
I don't know. I'll get it out in a week for sure. Hopefully sooner.
No, that's great. And I've really enjoyed it. And I hope you get many more people to speak to. I don't know who you have on your radar, but
yeah, well, I've been thinking that I'm enjoying. Like, I'm going to talk to Zach and John again, I'm going to talk to John and Christoph. I was thinking I'd rather focus on a few people and go into depth with those few people than just have a lot of people.
Right.
I'm totally new at this game, right?
Yeah.
It's a totally new project for me, and I don't know I don't know what I'm doing at all. But what feels right to me is not put out sort of generic podcasts, but to talk with individuals like you and go into depth with them. You know,
that's great. I think it's good. I think every podcast has to find its distinctiveness, and that sounds like a good way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. So we'll see how this goes, but I'd love to talk to you again, and maybe with some other people, or
sure.
However.
Well, no, I'm beginning to enjoy.
Right.
I've been for a couple of years relatively quiet for various reasons. Just
right, yeah. I mean, I was surprised that you agreed to talk to me because
I'm coming out a little bit.
I haven't seen you like in this realm much. And
no, I've been like, for example, I've said no quite a lot in the last couple of years, partly from being too busy, partly just not being quite ready at some level. But now I feel a bit more up for it.
Cool, great.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks a lot, Andrew, and look forward to seeing it when it's ready.
Thank you very much. Have a fine evening, and all the best to you and your family. And
you too. Stay safe, and
take care.
Take care. Bye bye.